Welcome to Free Speech TV. My name is Carl Nagin. We are broadcasting live from the Bioneers conference, and my guest today is the CEO of Bioneers and one of its co-founders, Kenny Ausubel. Kenny is one of the most inspiring and original voices in the progressive movement. Bioneers as a conference has been running for nearly 3 decades, and it has brought together a very unique mix and cast of speakers and participants from both the progressive political sphere, the sphere of indigenous spirituality, and science, nature-based science and health. And it has been bringing visionaries, change makers, luminaries in those fields together for nearly 3 decades. Kenny, welcome to Free Speech TV, and thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Why don't you start by telling us a bit about the genesis of Bioneers, how it got started, what its mission is, and how that's changed over the years?
Well, the truth is it was actually born in a hot tub in the mountains above Santa Fe.
I love it. Perfect.
I was hanging out with a very good friend who's one of the early socially responsible investors, and he'd been an investor in the company that I started, Seeds of Change, that I started in 1989. That was a biodiversity seed company whose design was to be a market partnership with backyard gardeners to bring diversity back into the food web and to create and produce organic seeds, which are the first link in the food web, and still seeds are not organic even today for the most part. But it had started much earlier than that. You know, I came of age during the 60s, and anyone who was paying attention saw that we were on a collision course with nature, and it was not going to end well. And so I didn't kind of want to sit there shivering in the dark, trembling with fear and worrying about it. And so I wanted to know, what can I do? You know, and who's out there, who's doing real stuff? And one by one, I began to find these remarkable individuals, and there were 2 sort of characteristics for each of them. One was they were all systems thinkers. They took us what we call a solve the whole problem approach. You know, John Muir the naturalist once said, in nature, everything is hitched to everything else, right? And the same is true. Human systems and natural systems are one system at the end of the day. So you really need to look at the entire, you know, we're not going to address the environmental crisis without dealing with inequality and injustice and poverty.
That's the basis of deep ecology.
That's right, exactly. And the other characteristic was that they had all looked to nature for solutions. And, you know, after all, this is 3.8 billion years of real world R&D. You know, the disarmingly simple question, how would nature do it, can occupy lifetimes of study. I mean, we know so little at this point. So anyway, I began to just meet all these amazing people, and I'm a journalist by trade, among other things, and, you know, occasionally wrote stories, but I was hanging out with Josh Mailman, who founded Social Venture Network, in this hot tub above Santa Fe, ranting and raving about these Bioneers, people who had looked to nature. And he stopped me at one point and said, well, why don't you have a conference? And I had literally never been to a conference in my entire life. I thought it sounded intensely boring, and I just kind of moved on and kept talking about all these people. And a little later, he stopped me mid-sentence and said, Kenny, here's $10,000, have a conference. And that was actually how Bioneers started.
How many people came to the first one?
I think about 300 people, which seemed huge at that time.
And now you've got nearly 3,000 coming to this.
Over 3,000, yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And so your programs, and you have links via media so it's broadcast to other cities and other groups, is that correct?
It's even on Free Speech TV.
That's right.
So, yeah.
And you've got a website, and you've got all kinds of, you use social media very much as part of your dissemination of these ideas.
Yeah, I mean, the conference is what we call the live act, and, you know, for one thing, it's great to have a platform where people whose voices have often not been heard can have a stage and a platform and actually be heard. But the real afterlife is the media that comes from that, and we produce many media, and that's a lot of my background personally. And we, you know, have an annual radio series that's heard by millions of people all over the world now. And but the talks are not your normal talks. I mean, this is vision in action. Yes. It's people who are actually, it's not just ideas, they're applying them. And we screen speakers, obviously, for their eloquence and their ability to communicate well. So it's a lot of storytelling in the best
Wonderful.
sense. You know.
And I like this aspect of Bioneers. I've always admired the implementation of the ideas. So you have programs that are ancillary to the conference. Could you describe some of those and what kinds of activities they're involved in?
Sure. Well, we have, well, you know, when I started Seeds of Change, I had gotten involved several years earlier with this fellow, Gabriel Howarth, who is a master organic farmer and a seed saver, seed collector. And his teachers had told him, if you really want to learn about farming, go study with native peoples. These are the people who've been doing it forever and they really know what they're doing. So he ended up in Mexico and then Latin America and came back with this extraordinary ark of seeds. And he stuck a bunch of them in the ground at San Juan Pueblo, just north of Santa Fe where I live, which is one of the Indian pueblos in New Mexico. And I was initially invited to film it. I'm a filmmaker, and it was an extraordinarily transformational experience to understand that these seeds are the thin green line between starvation and humanity being able to feed itself. And essentially what was happening at that time, this was the mid-'80s, was that the large chemical companies were, they're into patents, basically,
Yes.
as you I'm sure know. And so they did not want to have open pollinated seeds that are self-replicating, that farmers can grow themselves each year and share with their neighbors or whoever. And so I discovered that these seeds were under threat, at that time. And one native farmer on the Pueblo was standing in front of the camera holding these red corn seeds in his hand, and he started weeping. And I started paying extra close attention. And the story he told was that Gabriel had put the word out throughout the Pueblo if anybody had any old seeds lying around, which is often how these things turn up. And this man, James Chancellor, had found a little pot buried in the mud wall of his adobe home, just visible, that had the red corn seeds that turned out to be the sacred red corn of San Juan Pueblo that had not been grown in 40 years.
So
and
a
could well have
synchronous moment.
disappeared. Exactly. And I really got it in that moment, but we started working right away with native farmers, because what you also learn is it's not just the seed stocks that are endangered, it's the cultural knowledge that goes with it, which is going even faster than the seed stocks and is irreplaceable. They say every time a shaman dies, it's like burning the library at Alexandria, and that's really true. So the indigenous thinking and indigenous practices were very much part of the inspiration for Bioneers, and from the very beginning, and we're based in New Mexico, and we have a headquarters now in San Francisco, but it's always been operating
But you
there.
have an indigenous program that brings together and it nourishes leadership within the Native American community. Is that correct? Could you describe that program and
Sure.
some of its activities?
Well, yeah, I would say, Native people have actually, when we first started offering a space at the conference for them to speak at the very beginning, 1990, 91, there was already tremendous leadership in Indian country. It was just very under-recognized at that time. And it was across the broad spectrum of issues that face every community, from food security to politics. And for example, in 1992 was the 500th anniversary of Columbus. And so we did a meta program from a native point of view about what colonization and genocide have looked like and
A
what
national
survival.
day of mourning.
Right. Well, and the Renaissance in the sense, there's a Renaissance in Indian country. They've survived, actually,
Yes.
and they're now flourishing, or beginning to in certain ways. And so we've always presented, had a very political lens that we bring to this, because this is about colonization and imperialism and, feral capitalism in its worst forms. And so, but the indigenous program, what happened was more and more Native people kept coming to the conference, and in 2007, a sort of group of Native people came to us and said, we would really like to have our own space that's a sovereign space that's Native directed within the conference. And so we started this thing called the Indigenous Forum, and we have 2 indigenous staff members who actually put that entire program together each year. And I think last year we had 94 Indian nations represented here
Wonderful.
at Bioneers.
That's
So
extraordinary.
it's become a very important hub. And then this year, we've always been very supportive of different initiatives, as well as simply the communications, because people don't hear about this too many places, especially directly from Native people. But so we've started an initiative that's around law and governance. And I don't know if you're familiar with this emerging movement around rights of nature.
Tell us.
So we have a fundamental systems error, which is why, despite all these environmental regulations and laws, things keep getting worse and worse. And that systems error is that nature is considered property. If you own your 10 acres, whatever it is, you can do whatever you want with it, right? So that is simply, I mean, if, as the Archbishop of Canterbury once said, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, right? I mean, if anybody is property, it's not nature, it's us.
What happened to the commons in our law?
Exactly. And so there's a movement now to actually grant legal rights to nature, and people can have standing on behalf of nature as a trustee for a critter or an ecosystem or a river, or whatever it may be. And through a daisy chain of connections that originated at Bioneers, that's where the Ecuadorian Constitution in 2008 incorporated rights of nature, the first national constitution in the world. So that movement, I've been tracking it for the last decade or so, and it has really been growing. So we decided this past year to offer, in a partnership with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, who are very brilliant pro bono attorneys. Yes, they're really good. We're offering trainings in Indian country in the US for how to institute rights of nature frameworks. That is one more tool in the toolbox to protect, to conserve land.
You have a speaker here, Nyland Pike, who is very involved in the Oak Flats controversy, where Rio Tinto, one of the large multinational mining corporations, is basically through some very sneaky legislative moves in the last months of the Obama administration, acquired rights to this Indian sacred land. And could you talk a little bit about that as an example of politics, spiritual wisdom, and science, the interface there, and how the movement to liberate that area, to occupy that area, speaks to that?
Well, I think that struggle is emblematic of so many struggles in Indian country, at large. I mean, what just happened this past year with Standing Rock is an identical kind of a paradigm, where you have, in that case, it was a Canadian company, in fact, another foreign company. But it doesn't matter, it's multinational capitalism, and it's rape, pillage, and plunder. And the law is basically set up to permit that stuff to go on and to empower it to go on. And 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is on Indian lands. That's no accident. It's also the knife's edge between clean energy and dirty energy, extractive industries. So, and from an indigenous point of view, the land, for one thing, sustains us all. So that's the default position to start from. But if you go one step further to what, we live in a society where literally nothing is sacred. Yes. And that is not true in Indian country. And it's a sacredness also of the great mystery that we know so little. I mean, humility is our constant companion. The more we learn, the less we know, and so I think Oak Flats has been one of those kinds of struggles where this egregious wrong is being done that's clearly just a, corporate state capture, basically.
Yes.
Against the most vulnerable, whose voices are, not heard very much. So
you go where the silence is.
Right.
You have other programs as well, a youth leadership program, a women's leadership program. Can you talk about those, how those programs implement some of the ideas that were born here?
Yeah. Well, one thing I would say is, first of all, in nature there can be great soloists, but at the end of the day it's all about the symphony, And I think we kind of look at Bioneers like that. It's a community of leadership. There's some amazing soloists and all that, but at the end of the day, it's a symphony, and everybody is playing a really incredibly important role in that regard.
Well, I can't think of any other organization that brings together that kind of visionary leadership from so many distinct domains to be in dialogue and to create a kind of ripple effect. So I'm interested to hear about these other programs as well.
And I think it was 1999 that Julia Butterfly came out of her tree.
Yes.
We'd had her by cell phone when cell phones weighed half a pound the year before. And that was incredibly dramatic for all of us here on the other end of the line. But then she came down
Occupy
from
the
Luna,
redwoods.
right? But Julia came down from Luna and came here and spoke in this very theater. And a few people gathered on the lawn outside afterwards and said, "Where are the young people?" There were literally about half a dozen young people. And we said, "Well, they haven't been interested. We don't know." And so Julia helped us to start a youth program. And as of last year, 20% of the entire audience was young people, over
That's
500
fantastic.
young people. Yeah. And so it's good to know you're not older than the way.
For our viewers who might be interested, how would they become involved in the youth leadership program, or what sort of possibilities are there for people who want to engage?
Well, there are multiple channels. One thing, obviously, is to participate in the conference, because there's a lot of stuff that goes on here as well as before and after. And then we also do multiple other programs year-round, particularly around food systems. There's a program called Just Us for Food Justice. Sorry.
Terrific. Say that 4 times in a row.
Right, exactly. But so many young people get involved with environmental issues through social justice issues, and through access issues. And food is often the portal, into that broader awareness.
Right.
So we do a lot around permaculture, organic farming practices, but also social access and how do you design a fair green economy. And there have been many spin-offs and projects that have come out of that. There's the People's Grocery in Oakland. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I am.
That came
In
out
my
of
neighborhood.
Bioneers, and now has expanded obviously into, they're putting together a major supermarket in the area. They're a store and all kinds of other projects. So, but I think, when you look at the history of social movements, it's usually youth at the forefront.
Yes.
And that is true right now in the Arab Spring. It's true in many of the movements in Europe. I mean, it's certainly true in this country. The Divest Invest movement was student-led. 350.org got its start in, Middlebury College. So we're very, very grateful that so many young people, I mean, seeing the young people is the most inspiring thing to me. They're so lit up. And they have so much less baggage than I did at that age, and so much more consciousness in so many ways. So there's great hope in our youth. Yeah.
On a personal level, you came from a political activist background. You were involved in SDS in the 60s, Students for Democratic Society. How did you make this switch, this transformation into this broader systems view? Was there an epiphany one day? Was it in the hot tub, or was this a slow evolution on your part in your thinking?
Well, yeah, it's hard, with these types of things to not
Pin
get
it
into
down.
sort of stereotypes, no, because even, many of us who were activists in the 60s had a much broader worldview. It wasn't just a narrow political view in that way. I, like many people, was deeply influenced by psychedelics in that period, which gave me a very strong sense of nature and of the invisible world that, is not something that is normally considered in human affairs, or at least in this society. But I also had a very severe health crisis that was life-threatening, and ended up sort of having to drop out for a period of time just to try to heal myself. And in the course of that, realized I had to get out of the city, and I moved to a small farm in northern New Mexico in hopes of rebuilding my health and my strength. And it was there that I fell in with a bunch of back-to-the-landers who were doing solar building and composting toilets and growing organic food and, the whole thing. And so it ended up being very fortunate in that way. I had got a window into a whole other world that I didn't know about, and I had felt very sort of helpless as a city kid. I didn't know what to do out there in the wild, and I wanted to learn. But ultimately, what you come to in that type of a health crisis is there's a moment of choice where you actually have to decide if you want to live or die.
Yes.
And I was pretty clear that I wanted to live, and that meant I had to learn how to heal. And what I learned is that nature has a profound capacity for healing, and that's really where it all starts. And in many ways, that's the seed energy of Bioneers. It's fundamentally about healing our relationship with nature, and learning to work with nature to help nature heal. Nature is incredible. I mean, everything heals eventually. It's just a matter of how long it takes. But I think that aspect of my own health crisis is really what brought forth this awareness about natural healing in that way.
If you think about the issues that engaged you when Bioneers was starting, and how the world looks now, given the current political climate, what's changed, or where are the priorities now for Bioneers? Are they the same? Is it a more grave crisis that we're facing now? How do you reckon with that?
I think we knew most of what was up at that time. I mean, Bill McKibben had just published The End of Nature, around that time. The Soviet Empire was crumbling. There were mass revolutions all over that part of the world, big upheaval. But, I remember quite well, actually, because Time magazine had a cover by Christo that was a sort of shellacked, bound up Earth on the cover. And the title was Endangered Earth.
Yeah.
And there was actually a lot of hope at that moment. The world leaders were coming together in recognition of the environmental crisis and also recognizing social issues and poverty and injustice as being core to that. Right. So I think it was actually a lot of hope at that time.
Yes.
One of the big inspirations for me with starting Bioneers was what's now known as biomimicry. At the time, the field didn't even have a name, but this idea of looking to nature for solutions, which has 3.8 billion years of R&D under her belt, not bad. Good place to start. Yes. How would nature do it? The disarmingly simple question. And so that's something that was a blip at that point that we...
And you've had many speakers at Bioneers who've addressed issues around...
Oh, from day one.
From day one.
Yeah, and of course in '97 is when Janine Benyus came out with her landmark book, Biomimicry Innovation Inspired by Nature. And so that was a landmark event. And just to give you another example, but we've witnessed biomimicry, the arc of biomimicry, it's now entering the mainstream. Yes. And the goal now is to have it become the default position within the next 5 or 6 years. And it could well do that. It's actually, there's enough momentum. And you may be aware, but last year, California became the first state, I believe the first place anywhere, to have mandatory K-12 environmental education.
Yes.
So we're now entering into a partnership with Biomimicry Institute to work with the California educational system to have biomimicry become part of that K-12 curriculum.
Wonderful.
So what would happen if our young people grew up learning about nature by learning directly from nature?
Yes.
What would happen if they could learn
Quite
to
a ripple
apply
effect.
that? Yeah, so we're interested in these kind of game-changing projects. And we've come a long way in the last 28 years, actually. There's what was then not on the radar screen. I mean, we might as well have been a UFO. A lot of this stuff was just laughed at, ridiculed, is now solidly on its way.
Mainstream.
Yeah, and now the question is how do we get it to scale very, very quickly? So that's a lot of what
But we're facing
on.
a very regressive political climate.
At this moment,
yes.
At this moment, I don't think it's going to last much longer. I think there's going to be a huge progressive swing of the pendulum.
And you are part of that, and I thank you very much for talking to us and with us and being such an inspirational force. So, Kenny, describe some of the other programs that Bioneers has launched that are creating this kind of ripple effect that I see as a kind of systems idea that underlies so much of your work.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, we sort of grew up alongside the Seeds of Change company around seed diversity and fair food systems. And so food and food systems has always been a cornerstone for us. And part of our impact is our influence, because this is a community of leaders and people get a chance to cross-pollinate across very diverse sectors. So through our friends at a wonderful group called Acres USA, we first came across this farmer named Joel Salatin, who basically has demonstrated that small, to medium-sized organic farms can feed the world. And Joel has this extraordinary kind of meta permaculture system that is mind-blowing. And anyway, after he spoke here in '97, I referred his work to Michael Pollan. And Michael ended up making Joel the centerpiece of first Power Steer in the New York Times Magazine and then of the Omnivore's Dilemma. And so that was a good example of how Bioneers' influence can spread. And Michael has called Joel the organic farmer who proves organics can feed the world.
Fantastic.
So we've been very intent on pursuing all that. And last year, through our friends at the Buckminster Fuller Institute, we learned about Bren Smith, who does what he calls 3D ocean farming. Ooh. And in a very, very small column of water, that's part of the innovation, it's vertical farming with ropes and buoys. So that when you look on the surface, you don't see anything except a couple of buoys bobbing around. but beneath it is basically an octopus's garden, you know.
Extraordinary.
And they can grow massive amounts of clean food, both seaweeds, including kelp, and other very nutritious sea vegetables, and shellfish. So clams, oysters,
Extraordinary.
shrimp.
Where are they based? Or where are they
He's
doing
based
this?
on the East Coast,
East Coast.
And it's starting to spread on the East Coast, but it also does massive carbon sequestration, I mean,
Whoa.
huge scale, and actually restores the vitality of the ecosystem. It's like having a reef, in effect. It attracts lots of other vital ocean life. And Bren is really wonderful politically. He has an economic democracy model. So it costs only about $30,000 for a new ocean farmer to get started. It's a very low barrier of entry, and you can be employing within a year or two up to 10 people and clearing several $100,000, right?
Extraordinary.
So we have decided to work with, we're honored actually to work with Bren, and what we're doing is he really wanted to bring it here to California, because what happens in California doesn't stay in California. And it's the 6th largest economy in the world. And so we're now doing the research at UC Santa Barbara.
Wonderful.
With the Bren
Where
School.
my granddaughter is in school in environmental science, so I'm happy to hear
Well,
that.
she will be hearing about this. The research is happening right now.
Terrific.
To prove it out, and that'll hopefully bring the data to the Coastal Commission that it needs to approve it. And then we're setting up a seed fund, or we call it a spawn fund, to spawn tons of these 3D farms all across California and ultimately the West Coast.
Fantastic.
And this can literally feed the world, and it can reduce pressures on terrestrial farming by 90%, which is a huge issue, while producing massive amounts of kelp. That's been one of the missing pieces in scaling organic farming. There's not enough organic compost and fertilizer. So we're super excited about Bren's work and that project. And really moving that forward.
Have you thought on an international scale for Bioneers, for moving this beyond North America to other countries, some of your projects?
Yeah, and we've done several events in the past. We did a major event in Holland, actually, that was focused principally on biomimicry, and that led to multiple iterations of biomimicry in Holland, and we're looking at doing more global stuff in the years to come, for sure. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
You also have a women's leadership program. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, my wife and the
Yes.
co-founder of Bioneers, Nina Simons, is very passionate about this. It's her main thing. And in '97, she actually organized a parallel set of plenaries that was about restoring the feminine. The idea is that we all contain qualities of the masculine and feminine. Nobody is all one or all the other. You couldn't be biologically or culturally. And that we really need to restore that balance. And at the same time, the leadership of women is critical and has been obviously very under-recognized and actually discouraged. And the studies are overwhelming. Nations where you find women in leadership and real decision-making are healthier, wealthier, more democratic. There's less conflict either domestically or globally. I mean, on and on and on. So
the fastest way, UN studies show that the fastest way for a country to get out of poverty is women's education.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Olivia,
and similarly with
example.
climate is another example of that. Yeah. So Nina does a lot of women's leadership trainings. We've done a lot of facilitations and gatherings, and a lot of it is around leadership development and bringing forth networks of women leaders who are connected with each other. And it's across, again, all different walks of life, all different types of activity and domains. So that's a lot of our focus, and we're looking for some opportunities. We're looking at some opportunities now to how to bump that up. So, yeah.
As you look ahead to establishing a legacy for Bioneers, what are you envisioning for the future?
Well, I think we're actually in a revolution right now, for real. This is it. And for those of us who came of age in the 60s, it was 6-7 years into it before people really understood that things were never going to be the same again after this, right? And we've witnessed this work mature and evolve and spread over these 28 years, and it's actually ready now to go to scale, and in some cases it is. I mean, the clean energy revolution is unstoppable. They're saying by 2020, actually, oil is going to start declining. By 2025, we will have only electric cars. There's going to be billions of dollars of stranded assets of oil. I mean, this is, the transportation revolution is going to finish off gasoline completely. And we won't even have individual car ownership. We're going to have fleets, basically, So the question now is, what are the real leverage points, and also what are the real barriers? and what's really stopping this from happening, because it wants to happen. And from, I think, our perspective, the rhinoceros in the room is corporate power. It's really that simple. And that's what the Uprising is. We call this year's conference Uprising, because that's what's going on all over the world. Democracy movements rising up, anti-austerity schemes, anti-oligarchy, anti-plutocracy, you know, anti-corruption. The corruption is so huge, flagrant, my God. I mean, it's just gangster capitalism left and right here, you know, so.
Masked under nationalism and economic nationalism, right?
So I think the movement to revoke corporate rights and corporate personhood is something we're deeply involved in and will only be more involved in. I think more and more people are awakening to how that, you know, how anti-democratic this system actually is. And I think it'll take some years here, but I think we're witnessing the beginnings of a next American revolution.
Terrific.
You know,
and you're one of the leaders, and I thank you, Kenny.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.